Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're going to touch on a really important topic today, the importance of onboarding your workforce. My name is Lorna F. Peters. I'm the director of the Small Business Development Center here at Austin Peay, and we're just excited to have this discussion with you. I have some of my friends joining me tonight, to include Lynn Staggs of Stone, Rudolph, and Henry. I'll let her introduce herself.
Alrighty. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And I know you're going to be picking up a lot more information this evening, just like we did last week. I am Lynn Staggs. I'm the marketing senior for Stone, Rudolph, and Henry. And Stone, Rudolph, and Henry is an accounting firm that has been in business for over 65 years. We have two offices, one in Clarksville and one in Brentwood. And we offer tax preparation services along with tax planning, audit services, business accounting, and consulting. We also have affiliate partnerships with other firms to provide legal services, financial planning services, and elder care planning for our clients. Excuse me. You are going to get to hear from some of them next week because we will be discussing financial goals for your business, investing in the proper equipment, taxes, and how choosing what kind of business, like a C Corp or S Corp, how that affects your taxes and all. So there will be a lot to learn about the money side of your business next week. So we look forward to that. So I will turn it back over to Lorna to get started with the second phase of the business startup.
Thank you so much. Let me just take a minute to introduce Len Stoltz. He's a business specialist here at the Small Business Development Center, and we're happy to have him here with us tonight virtually. All right, let's get to the meat of our conversation tonight. We would like to turn it over to Miss Martha Wall. She is, I'm looking at my notes to remember everything I want to say about you, Mrs. Wall. You are the HR director of the Workforce Essentials of Workforce Essentials. You've been in that position for 5 years, but you have been in the HR field for a very long time. You've owned your own business for years. So I know you have a lot to share with us today. I'll turn it over to you.
I'm a little Zoom challenged. I apologize, I needed to unmute. I have been with Workforce Essentials. Workforce Essentials is a workforce development company that's in 60 counties in the state of Tennessee. We the American Job Centers in 13 counties, adult education. We work with the Families First. It's all about helping people become the better version of themselves and achieve placement that is unsubsidized employment to help them achieve and maintain employment. So I'd like to say welcome, and I'm excited to be here. I understand you all are small business owners. I have walked a mile in your shoes for about 15 years. So one of the best things I ever did was join SHRM, which is SHRM. That is the Society for Human Resource Management. I have gotten my SHRM certification as a certified professional with them. And this website, shrm.org, is something you all need to remember because it is an excellent resource for anything employment or employee related for guidance in terms of human resources. So onboarding is an interesting topic. I believe that it starts job description or advertising for the posting. You need to define your job description. What task is it that you're going to ask your new employee to hire? This job description, and I have included a sample that Lawrence will send to you after this presentation, and it's titled How to Develop a Job Description. And briefly what that does is it gives you a description of the job, general responsibilities, requirements for the position, whether it's educationally, and skills that are obtained. This gives you a format and also an ability to post that job so that you will attract the best possible employees. You line up your expectations on the front end, and believe me, it saves you much later on. So, going hand in hand with that, once you've posted your job and you've selected who you want to hire, you need to send a job offer letter. And that job offer letter is a very good practice, and sending it in writing is great for you and great for the employee because it clearly defines you're offering them, what the pay rate is, and you can include benefits that might be available to them. I always choose to include in my job offer letter the date and time for new hire orientation and the types of documentation they may need for their ID, for I-9s, or direct deposit information. This is a good best practice, and it also impresses your new employee that you've sent this to them in writing. You keep it for your files, and those two go hand in hand because that way you know you've sent it all in the right details. So you have two samples of a job offer letter, one for a regular employee and one for a temporary employee. And Lawrence will be sending those after this presentation to you. The next thing is that I always do 3 days before new hire orientation. I send my new employees a reminder email and say, welcome, we're excited you're going to be here. Here's your new hire date and orientation location. Please remember to bring your required documents. This lets them know how excited you are to be bringing them on board, as well as you're reminding them to bring the correct documentation so you have everything you need on day of hire. The next thing that I do once they arrive for new hire orientation, I have an employee handbook. And this is something that is very important for all small business owners. When you first think about it, you think, oh, I'm brand new and I'm just starting and I don't need that. Trust me when I tell you, and I think Dr. Miller, who's going to speak in a little bit, will agree, this sets you up for success. This defines all your policies and procedures, and it covers you legally for the duties or the questions that may come up while a person is employed. Now, I have sent an example, an article on how to develop an employee handbook from SHRM, as well as a template for an employee handbook that SHRM provides. You can use that template and plug your information in, and it will get you started in the right direction. Those things, having them done before you bring your person into orientation, will set you up for success. What I do so that I make that day easier is I take and I made a PowerPoint. I don't have one for this time, but what I do is I outline the employee handbook, and I start by sharing personal information about our company, what we do, what areas we cover, what locations we're in, and we make it personal so that you're sharing with those employees, here is who you're working for, here is our history, here are our values. And then I follow that PowerPoint and I try to make it, I can tell you, and I know this from experience, how many times have you gone to take a new job and somebody pushes a folder across the table to you and they say, please fill this paperwork out. And you look at it, you don't have time to read it. You don't know what you're signing. You don't get copies of what you're signing. So what I try to do is to incorporate my paperwork along with the PowerPoint to make it an interesting journey. This way, once we do our I-9s, I explain what the I-9 is, what IDs they need to have, and we coordinate it as we go through. You're giving yourself a guide to make sure you don't forget anything. And at the same time, I give the employees copies of the forms they filled out to take home for their reference so that they can keep it and refer to it, because they're signing these documents and we're going to hold them to them for knowing and being responsible for knowing that information. So best practice in my book is always give them copies of the paperwork they sign. Then that way, your employees are set up for a roadmap for success. because we've all invested time and money, and we want these people to love us and stay with us for a long time. And then we want them to have access to any questions they may have. Give me just a minute. I'm referring to my notes. I'm sorry. I'm a little Zoom challenged. But I want to make sure also, as part of onboarding, some companies have an online payroll program. So you want to make sure that you include all the little warm, fuzzy details that will make their life a little easier when they first start. We have a web-based program, so I give them handouts with the web address and step-by-step information on how to log into it. Pull it up on the screen so they see the process. So while they may not remember everything I've covered in orientation, they have a document to refer to and they don't feel lost on their first day. I also confirm with them, since we are in 60 counties, I do my orientation locally, but they know where they're going to report the first day. They know what time they're going to report that day. And as part of that, I cover our dress code so they know what to wear so they're appropriately dressed. And it's all about setting your employees up for success and giving them the basic information they need to be successful. Ms. Lawrence, I believe that kind of covers it in a nutshell, and the documents that you have, they can refer to as good examples.
Perfect. Any questions for Mrs. Wall? I have a question for you. Many of the businesses we are working with, a lot of times it's just them as an employee.
Yeah.
What suggestions you have for a one-man show? As they get
A one-man show, honestly, to be very honest, they're not going to sue themselves if they own the business. A lot of these guidelines are when you begin taking on employees, because you want to make sure you're doing everything legally and ethically correct according to the guidelines for wage and hour, I-9, all of these types of things. So as they start to add employees, that's where they need to start adding these steps in.
Thank you so much. All right, our next presenter tonight is Dr. Gloria Miller. She is a professor at Austin Peay in the College of Business. She has been at Austin Peay for over 9 years, but just like Mrs. Hall, she has been in the HR field for a very long time, and she has some great wisdom and information to share with us today. So I'd like to turn it over to you, Dr. Miller.
Thank you, Lorna. I do have some PowerPoints, so I'm going to pull them up and share them with all of us as I go through the material. And I can share these slides with Lorna afterwards, and she can send them out, but you'll have this also in your recorded copy. So I'm talking about managing employees. And so Marty had talked about bringing them on board. So now what? Now you've got the employees, what are you supposed to do with them? Often I hear people say to me, well, what if I train them and they leave? What if I train the employees and then they leave? And my answer to that is a very loud and emphatic, what if you don't train them and they stay? So never hesitate to train your employees on their job and even possibly other things. There are companies that have trained their employees, if they're not English speakers, they've trained them on speaking and reading English. And again, that's going to benefit you. And if they've left, you can just figure karma's going to pay off and they're going to do better off in the rest of the world. It is a good thing to remember that turnover is not always negative. Sometimes people, you do need them to move on. Either you have to terminate them or they leave. So having somebody leave the company is not always a negative situation. But what I always wanted to remember, and it is hard when you're an HR manager or even more so when you're an owner of a company, if you have to terminate somebody, it's very helpful to look back at that first interview and see if there were signs that you didn't see that you may be able to learn from. And again, it's very hard to say, yeah, I should have caught that, but that'll keep you from doing a bad hire in the future. So turnover can be a positive. And Tennessee is an employment at will state. What that means is the employee or the employer can end the relationship at any time with any amount of notice for any reason or no reason, as long as that reason doesn't break any laws. So you can fire an employee for no reason. You can simply say, you're done. I've done that. It's extremely hard for the employee and makes them angry. So it is, in my opinion, and from best practices, it is a good idea to give them a reason, but you can fire anybody at any time for any reason, as long as it's not discriminatory. So what to manage? Now you have a few employees. When you have an employee, you want to manage their behaviors, not their attitudes. All right. You can't change someone's attitude, but you can control the unacceptable behaviors. If you've got an employee that is coming in a foul attitude, you don't want to tackle that, but you do want to tackle any behaviors that causes. So if they come in a foul attitude and they swear, don't talk to them about the foul attitude, talk to them about the swearing. All right. So if you have an attendance issue of an employee, don't call them lazy. Don't even go from that point. Just talk about them missing the days that they did. Interpersonal relationships or a foul attitude. Don't talk to them about being mean, but zero in on the appropriate behaviors, name calling, ignoring communications. At my first HR job, we had an employee that was a bully, and she had been written up for being a bully with no details, and she continued to be a bully. So I tried to counsel her and tell her which behaviors were unacceptable. She kept doing them, and I did end up terminating her for being a bully. But what I terminated her for were the behaviors that she was doing that she would not change after being told to. If they've got poor quality work, again, don't call them lazy, but do think about the fact that they might be untrained. If they're not doing good work, have you trained them in that job enough? If they are not trying, that's one thing, but if they're trying and just need more training, think about doing that. So an important start, Marty had mentioned this, job descriptions. They're really important. You do likely have a job ad if you put one out there, but they might not have specifics. So do have a job description of any job that you have in your company, except yours, of course, as owner. And job descriptions can change. So if you're going to become a two-man office and your job description is for the other half of the office, it's going to have a ton of tasks on there. And then if you hire somebody else, that job description may be split into two or whatever, but job descriptions can be rewritten, but they really help in management. Make sure you have a good training program. Marty was talking about, orientation and training. Give your employees, as Marty said, the opportunity to succeed. So do train them in the skills to do the job. An employee handbook is key. I love that, that Marty had mentioned it. And then just be aware of the issue of exempt versus non-exempt employees. And this might be getting into the weeds a little bit, but this is whether or not you have to pay overtime to employees. As owners, I'm sure you don't even want to consider what your pay comes down to hourly, because often you take a hit at the beginning of an organization. But exempt employees are exempt from overtime. And that it's not a decision that you, the owner, can make. It has legal ramifications and it has legal definitions. So if you hire somebody and you want to pay a salary to them and not an hourly wage, make sure that they have a position that that meets the qualifications for that. You can Google exempt. You can Google, do I have to pay my person overtime? Or as Marty mentioned, and I'll mention again later, SHRM, SHRM.org is an excellent website to give you this type of information. But you cannot simply call somebody exempt and pay them a salary. They have to meet certain qualifications. So performance management is what I'm going to talk about here a little bit. You want to ensure employee activities are congruent with goals of the organization. This seems simplistic, but you don't want employees to be doing tasks that don't help the organization. And I'll get to that in a minute. Performance appraisals, you gather information on how well the employee is doing his or her job. And that job description is going to help you with a performance appraisal. Again, this is why you have to have that backed up. And performance feedback is when you give the employees the information on their performance. Mentioning that ensuring employee activities are congruent with the goals. You need to be careful what you measure for your employees. A task that is measured is going to be done by the employees. And that task might make sense to you at one point, but it might actually harm you. And I'll give you an example. I was a human resource manager of an answering service in Wisconsin. Our operators answered phone calls. And occasionally they'd have to put the person on hold and ask the team leader for information or whatever. So we had a statistic that we ran on all of our operators every month on average hold time, because we expected them to have to put people on hold, but we didn't want the time to be that long. And the average hold time, as I was doing the annual evaluations, was generally 30 seconds to 45 seconds, which seems a lot to the caller, but it's not that serious. I had an employee whose average hold time was less than 1 second. I could not understand that. And so I called him in, I asked what he was doing. He was having a line, and I said, you need to tell me. He wanted to have a good average hold time. So he took every caller and held his hand over the hold button and went click, click. So that person was on hold for a minuscule amount of time, but the caller was hearing click, click, and often they'd say, are you still there? So he was meeting a statistic that we told them he had to meet, that we thought was good for the organization, and it turned out actually to be harming the callers. So be careful what you measure. Lesson taught on that one. So performance management is a prevalent practice, but it's not often valued or used effectively. It's hard to write, annual evaluations. It's time consuming. And many managers don't consider them useful, but they really are. They're useful to the organization as well as the employees. Half of employees are surprised by their ratings. And what I need to tell you here is an employee should never be surprised for a negative rating on a performance evaluation. Anything that they've done wrong should have been dealt with at the time and then documented so that it can be included in their performance evaluation. On the flip side of that, anything that the employee has done well should also be documented, and either give them a pat on the back or not, but document both good and bad things throughout the year, so that when it comes time for the annual evaluation, you'll be able to remember. Because I guarantee if you've even got 5 employees, you will not remember everything those 5 employees did 12 months ago. So document activities. I literally had an Excel spreadsheet, and I would just enter them. So when I did my performance evaluation, I would have the specific activities that I could put in there. My employees actually were surprised occasionally that I would remember a positive activity. And that's a good surprise. But anything negative, they had already been dealt with. If somebody's doing something wrong in February, do not wait until December to tell them. Tell them in February, let them fix it. And then yes, it can hit their performance evaluation in December, but let them fix it early. And then most employees are unhappy because they expected a higher rating. Again, be sure to let them know throughout the year how they're doing. Some approaches on how to measure performance. Generally, performance evaluations are 1 through 5. 1 is poor, 5 is good, or doesn't meet expectation, meets or exceeds. do them as objectively as possible. If you've got ratings 1 to 5 and you give them a 5, that 5 doesn't mean that it's an objective number. It's still what you consider. So try to make them as objective as possible. Best practice, put down some reasons why you give each one of those ranks. Ranking employees, if you've got more than a few employees, can be helpful to keep you from having everybody scored the same. Supervisors, owners often will rank everybody 5s all the way down. Everybody has identical rankings. That's not helpful to anybody. So if you're forced to rank those people, and even if one gets a 4.9 and one gets a 4.8 and the other one gets a 5, that at least tells you where the people stand. Another way to measure performance, generally in larger corporations, is forced distribution, where a certain number of people have to meet, a certain number of people have to exceed, and a certain number of people have to not meet the qualifications. I'm going to talk about that. As I mentioned, that another way of doing that is forced distribution with termination of the bottom 10% of employees. I was a manager at Arthur Andersen, the accounting firm before it died, and they tried to do this forced distribution where I had to rank all my employees. I had 35 people underneath me, and they wanted me to rank them and fire the bottom 10% of the employees. It was a hot topic for a while, and the companies were doing that. It is really not a good idea. If you start doing that, you're going to get unwanted competition between employees because they don't want to be on the bottom. And when Arthur Andersen came to me, they said, this is a rule and you need to do it. And my response to them was, I terminated people throughout the year that weren't performing. Everybody that's here is performing at or above expectations. So no, I will not do that. So be careful of fads like that. Again, if you always terminate the bottom 10% of your employees, they say that you're going to get better and better people. But if I know that the bottom 10% of my type of job is going to get fired, I'm going to start competing a little too strong against those people. So be careful of doing that. Some best practices for measuring performance. Give employees the form shortly after starting the job. When they start the job, they should have that job description, right? It's also a really good idea to give them the performance measures so that they can see what you want. I was one time measured against something I didn't even know was part of the job. I got a 0 on it. I was horrified, but I had no idea that I was even supposed to be doing that for that job. So give them the form so that they know what you're going to be measuring. It's a good idea to ask the employees to do a self-evaluation. They fill out the form themselves, about themselves, but the important part is requiring reasons for the choices for each of them. Quite frankly, the good employees will often score themselves lower than you will, and the mediocre employees often score themselves higher, but you're looking more for those reasons to make sure that you're not totally out of line with your numbers. You do not need to average the numbers together. You don't need to meet those numbers. The most important part is those reasons to make sure that you're in line with the person. And then for any measure of does not meet expectations on any of the performance evaluations, agree what specific skills, behavior, and or results need to be improved, and then a timetable for accomplishment. So if you have somebody that does not meet expectations on attendance, talk to them about what you're expecting and a deadline when you expect that by. And then for any measure when you're talking about this, specify what the company will or will not do for that. If it's for not performing properly, the company may send that person for training and tell them that we will send you for additional training because we want you to behave properly. And so do indicate if the company is going to help them with that. Feedback should be given frequently, not just once a year. And again, if somebody's doing something good, tell them right away. If they're doing something wrong, tackle it right away so that they can fix it. Recognize effective, outstanding performance through praise. Please do that. But you've often heard praise in public, criticize in private. I'm saying that that's not always the best practice. The criticizing in private is almost always the right thing to do, unless they've done something awful in front of people and you need to let everybody know that that was not right. But praising in public isn't always the right thing to do. There are cultures and there are people that are very uncomfortable about being called out, even for something positive. So be careful of that. A lot of people do like the attaboy in front of people, but check in with the person and make sure that they're okay with that before you do that. Also agreeing to specific goals that the employee agrees with, and set a date to review the progress when you're doing performance evaluations. And those goals might be to maintain current performance. If you've got an employee that's doing everything right, you don't have to ask them to start jumping over brand new hurdles that are just made up so that they might have to strive harder. Let their goal be to maintain current performance. You don't have to falsify anything like that. And you want to follow legal guidelines when you do performance management, okay? Discrimination is huge. I'm going to get to that in a little bit. But if you need to talk about somebody who's not doing something right, or heaven forbid, need to terminate somebody, make sure it's not for a discriminatory reason. And again, I'm going to talk about that further in the future, or that it's an unjust dismissal for reasons other than the employer claims. It's always tempting to just hang the dismissal on one reason because you really don't want to get into something else. I had to dismiss somebody at the answering service because, and I didn't say this to her, but she was a drama queen. Everything was always up in it was awful around her. And so I had coached her several times and said, you need to stick to the job. You need to keep your personal life out of working hours. I tried and I tried. And then I finally did let her go. And I told her that it was because of bringing all of this stress and bother into the job. I could have said, I'm dismissing you for not meeting your qualifications for that month, or don't make up reasons. And then the unjust dismissal doesn't play into fact as much because of employment at will, but don't make up a reason for dismissing somebody. So do you need an HR manager? You're a new company, and again, if you're the only employee, no, of course you don't. The general rule of thumb is you do need an HR manager once you have about 30 or more employees. So if you've got, once you start to really grow at about 30 employees, you should definitely be thinking about having one person doing HR for your company. If you're less than 30 employees, you still need HR and employment law knowledge. A couple of ways to do that would be to have an employment lawyer on retainer for your company. We did that at the answering service. Even though I was an HR manager, we had an employment lawyer that I could call when I had a question. And SHRM.org, they are great. I'm glad that Marty is actually sharing the template for the employment handbook, because when I looked out there, they offer a lot of things to people, whether or not they belong to SHRM. So please check them out. You can type in questions, and they've got tons of templates out there. So you do need some HR employment knowledge as your company does grow. So you don't have an HR manager, so now what do you do, right? You want to make sure that you're not discriminating. Discriminating is taking an employment action on an employee or an applicant that is in a protected class. Basically, to stay safe, never make an employment decision on any characteristic that doesn't have to do with the job. The Civil Rights Act protects those first 5 categories: race, color, gender, religion, and national origin. You can't discriminate for any of them. Age, over 40 is protected. So if somebody's over 40, you can't call them the old guy and not hire them because you want useful employees. You never want to say that. You may want people that can learn, that know about a specific thing, but a specific software, but somebody over 40 could have learned that software too. So age should never play into an employment decision, although only the over 40 is protected. Disability, you cannot discriminate against disabled people or people that are perceived to have a disability. And that disability can either be mental or physical. For all of these, but particularly for disability, you never have to hire anybody that's not qualified. So all of these only refer to qualified people that are in these protected classes. So if you have a person with a disability that is able to do the job, they're qualified to do the job, you need to hire them. If they're the most qualified of the bunch. You should never say, I've got two people equally qualified, and this one is in a wheelchair, I'm gonna hire this one because it's easier. Don't do that. Just look at their ability to do the job. Marital status and pregnancy cannot be considered when you're hiring or disciplining, okay? And then gender now includes sexual orientation. Tennessee does not specify that you can't discriminate against sexual orientation. Wisconsin did, we had that law. But Tennessee does not list that specifically. However, the EEOC has now been finding cases dealing with sexual orientation to be covered under gender discrimination. So even though there's not a Tennessee state law that says that you can't, the national law regarding gender now is perceived by the EEOC, and they're the ones that, that decide the cases, that sexual orientation is a protected class. Those are all federal protected classes. And then Tennessee has a few more protected classes within their laws. Being military or called to military service, you shouldn't discriminate. Either way, you shouldn't only hire military, or you should never discriminate against military. Voting in elections, you cannot discipline somebody for voting in an election, either way, or actually even voting. Little known law, but if election day is, the polls are open from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. And if your shift is 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., you must allow your employee time to go vote during the day. It does not have to be paid, but you must allow them to vote. Wage garnishment. If an employee has had his wages garnished or is going to have them garnished, you cannot discriminate against them for having that done. And wage garnishment is normally done for unpaid taxes or for child support. And as an HR manager that has to deal with it, it can be a pain. You've got extra paperwork to do, but you can't discriminate against people for doing that. Filing workers' compensation claim. If somebody has filed a workers' compensation claim in the past, you can't not hire them because you think that they might do one against you also. So you can't use that in your decisions. And being called to jury duty. You cannot discriminate against somebody for that. When state and federal laws are different, the law that benefits the employee the most is the one that you need to follow. For instance, in Wisconsin, when I worked as an HR manager, there was a law that said that you could garnish an additional $2 per paycheck from your employee if you were doing a wage garnishment. And that was to cover the office work of having to do the garnishment. But there was a federal law that said you could not garnish money to cover that work. When I started, the company had been including that extra $2 per paycheck. And I said, well, you can't do that. The owner of the company said, yeah, we're following federal law. If you've got two laws that are different, the one that benefits the employee the most is the one you must follow. So I stopped garnishing that $2, and much to the owner's dismay, but I was able to tell him, you don't want to get in legal trouble for this. I reimbursed that employee for those $2 that had been taken out for the year before per paycheck. So again, you need to know state law, you need to know federal law, and they are generally there to protect the employee. Protected employee activity by the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act. Down here in Tennessee, it's easy for us to say we don't have unions, we don't need to know about union law, all of that. When I worked in Wisconsin, we had unions all over. Out of my 4 jobs up in Wisconsin, I was in a union for 3 of them. But the National Labor Relations Act, it's a federal law, prohibits employers from denying non-supervisory employees to discuss topics of pay, benefits, or working conditions. Many of you may want to have a policy that says that employees cannot discuss pay with each other. Quite frankly, I understand, because discussing pay, nobody ever wins. Somebody's going to feel hurt. But the fact that they are unable to discuss pay could keep them from forming a union if they wanted to. And forming a union is protected by the United States government. So you cannot prohibit your employees from discussing pay, benefits, or working conditions. You can tell them that they're not allowed to do it at work or on the premises. But when they talk about it on their own, you cannot keep that from happening. And you also cannot deny employees to discuss starting or joining a union. But again, you can prohibit them from doing that while on the job and while on the workforce. You don't have to allow them to put something up on the bulletin board that says, interested in union, come see me. You can keep that stuff out of your workplace, but you cannot keep employees from discussing it among themselves. It is all right to talk to employees about the benefits of not having a union, being that they have the right to be able to approach you as manager or as owner without having to go through a union steward. That's fine, but you can't threaten or coerce people from joining a union. Unemployment. This was something that I had to learn on the job when I was up in Wisconsin. Unemployment is denied for gross misconduct. If an employee has done something that is on purpose and really impacts your business, they will be denied unemployment. And this is something that's generally intentional. I fired somebody at the answering service for hanging up on callers. She would pick up the call and hang up on it because she felt she was working too hard. And so by doing this with every 3rd caller, she was taking less calls and she felt she was making it even. That impacted our business, of course. So she was denied unemployment when I terminated her. You can be and will be denied unemployment as an employee for most quitting circumstances. If you just decide to quit a job, you cannot apply for, well, you can apply for unemployment, but you're not going to get it. Unemployment is generally approved for quitting if it's actually a constructive discharge for medical reasons or for care of family member. A constructive discharge is something that, again, Arthur Andersen, I can talk about them now because they don't exist anymore, but they used to try to get their employees to quit when they wanted to fire them because they felt, and they were wrong, they felt that people would not get unemployment if they quit. So they would literally call somebody in and say, today is your last day. We're not going to be keeping you on as an employee. Would you like to quit? That's called a constructive discharge. You're basically telling the employee that they're being fired, but you're allowing them to quit so that it looks good on their resume. If that happens, they can receive unemployment as long as the reason isn't for gross misconduct. So if they're just not doing the job well or whatever, and you call them in and say, you know, we think it's time for you to move on, and they quit, that's not a normal quit, and they can still get unemployment. Medical reasons, if they quit for medical reasons, they're just medically unable to do the job, they can apply for unemployment. However, if they're medically unable to do the job, it's unlikely they're medically unable to do other jobs, and to receive unemployment, they have to be looking for work. So this is all up to the unemployment office, but I'm giving you some scenarios. Or if they need to care for, go ahead.
Dr. Mello, we're getting to the end. Let me just make sure, because you're providing so much great information. Do we have any questions so far?
This is actually my last screen.
Oh, is it? Okay, okay. I'll let
Yes, okay, okay. Unemployment surprises me that it is approved for absences. If you fire somebody for attendance, for being out too much, in Wisconsin anyhow, they would get unemployment because the state said it's not their fault if they get sick. And it can be approved for not doing the job well if they have tried to do the job well. All right. But the main point here is if unemployment is approved, that does not mean that the termination was not for a good reason. You can terminate an employee for a proper reason and they can still get unemployment. That does not have any impact on the reason why you may have terminated any employee. And sorry about that, Lorna. So does anybody have any questions on any of this? No?
I don't think we have any questions. If you do have a question, you can feel free to unmute and ask that question now.
Also, I do teach at Austin Peay. So if you look up on the Austin Peay website for my name, you can check with me. I'm not going to give you legal information, of course, but I may be able to direct you to some information in HR if you're interested. I do teach HR and I'm building an HR major for undergraduates at our college.
Yes. So for both of our speakers, we will send out, of course, the recording, also your contact information. So if anyone needs to contact you, and also send out the presentations both of you presented. So you have the PowerPoint, and I know Mrs. Ball had some handouts that she provided to me ahead of time, templates. So we can send that to all of you. If we have no other questions.
I have a question, Dr.
Okay.
Peters.
Yes.
Hi, this is Brianna Wright. I am an Austin Peay student. I just took an HR class over the summer, actually. What is the best way to enter the HR field as an HR generalist? Certification? For me, my main goal is to do training and development.
Really good question. I would say training and development is a little tougher. Sometimes it's a good idea to start working for an employment agency or to work for, I'm sorry, Marty, the organization you work for is Workforce Development. Is that correct, Marty?
Yeah, Workforce Essentials.
Workforce Essentials.
Development, yes.
Right. So Workforce Essentials or an employment agency may be able to employ you themselves, not send you on a different job, and you could learn HR activities through that. For certifications, you generally have to have 500 hours in HR in order to get the certification. They do have a student certification at this point, and it's just starting to roll out. The other thing that you could do is get some certificates for some sessions that you attend that probably Workforce Essentials would do, and possibly the SBDC, some of the trainings that they do might give you certificates. But, and I'm glad to hear that you've got an interest in one area. You'll generally probably want to start out as a generalist, doing everything, and then be able to start focusing on one area. I'm really glad to hear, though, that you're interested in HR. It's an amazing field.
Thank
I
you.
agree with Dr. Miller because the experience, getting that entry-level experience, even if you go in as a generalist in HR, you're getting familiar with the policies and the procedures, and you have the building blocks to move into training, and you can grow with whatever company you start with. So I totally agree. Experience will help you.
Good luck to you.
Thank you all so much for joining us today.